Okay, so this is my presentation on Niccolo Machiavelli, author of The Prince and other works. As you can see, he was born in 1469 in Florence, Italy. And just to give a little contextual history, Italy during his age was in a lot of chaos. There were constantly different rival leaders taking control, also foreign invaders. Italy was divided up into about 5 different city-states, and they were vulnerable to foreign invaders or just the next door neighbor might come and take over. So it was a pretty crazy time. Now, Niccolo himself was born to an attorney. He was pretty well educated by all accounts. He was taught Latin and history, grammar, rhetoric. So he was pretty well educated. According to himself, he came from pretty low means, and he said he was poor and worked his way up the ranks. I'm not really sure that's true. He was the son of an attorney, and many historians believe that he was actually the descendant of aristocracy from Tuscany. Anyhow, during his time in Florence was said to be a republic. It was ruled by a family called the Medici, or the House of Medici. There's their little royal crest or coat of arms, whatever you call that thing. The Medici were very powerful bankers that more or less ruled the Republic of Florence. Florence still maintained that it was a republic when really, in fact, they were ruled by a small oligarchy. In 1494, the Medici were kicked out of power by kind of a religious fanatic named Savonarola. Hope I pronounced that right. Savonarola wanted to make Florence a really highly religious city, but after a lot of things happened, like he lost a war to Pisa, and things just never worked out the way he thought they would. He was actually executed for heresy. So this brings us to 1498. In 1498, Machiavelli gets called to the civil service. He's actually elected to the second chancery, which is in charge of diplomatic affairs. Here's a little historical overview. You can see the Medici family ruled Florence from 1434 to 1494. Anyhow, so yeah, the French forces invade, and they reestablish the republic. Machiavelli is elected to the second chancery. He goes on quite a few diplomatic missions. He goes to France, Germany, Spain, I believe. He visits the papacy in Rome, and it's during this period of civil service that he's able to witness the brutal regime of Cesare Borgia, and he comes to see this. This will have a great impact on him. This is going to have a tremendous impact on his writing The Prince. He's also put in charge of the military to a certain extent. He's more or less made the Secretary of Defense. During his time there, one of his big things was he was against hired mercenaries. At the time, if one of these city-states wanted to go to war, they would hire foreign mercenaries, which didn't always work because the mercenaries, of course, weren't necessarily loyal to the nation that was paying them. If it was a particularly tough war, or the odds were pretty severe, they would be more apt to simply run away. So he was against that. He advocated and actually successfully stood up I guess a homegrown force, as you would call it, and he actually successfully took that force and was able to win a military conquest in Pisa, something that the previous leaders were unable to do. And and let's see. But so, yeah, he goes on lots of diplomatic missions. I'm guessing during this time, he was pretty well connected. He was meeting people. I'm sure he was well paid. He had power. He had prestige. The things that most people would like. Well, in 1512, the Medici family is able to get power again with the help of Spanish forces. So they come back into power, basically dissolve the Republic, and they take Machiavelli and they imprison him and they torture him. It said that they tortured him by hanging him up by his arms behind his back and thus dislocating his shoulders. He never admits to the conspiracy charges and always presumes his innocence, and finally he's let go, but he's removed from public office, obviously, and exiled from his city of Florence. He goes to live in an estate on the countryside, and it's here that you could tell he seems pretty bitter about not being in politics anymore. He really misses it. Being in politics and was his entire life. Like I said, he had friends, he had prestige, he had power. More likely, he had money. So it was something that he greatly missed. So that's when he began writing The Prince. The Prince is interesting because more or less The Prince, which he dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, was kind of like a job application. He wanted to write this for the Medici family so that they would see that he was, an okay guy, more or less on his side. He was just, at the time, the Medici predecessors, he was just, serving his city-state. He desperately wanted to get back into the graces of the government, and made this known to several friends and correspondents. Now also during this time, he wrote many plays and poems for which he was actually well known and famous for. Ironically, The Prince was not published during his lifetime. The Medici did read it, and I've heard various contradictory reports in my research on how they took it. Some said they didn't like it, and some said they actually kind of did like it. I've read in some places that Machiavelli actually gained a government post again, and I've read others that said he never did. So hard to say. A little conflicting information for me there. So yeah, The Prince, he wrote in 1513. Between 1513 and his death in 1527, he joins different discussion groups in Florence. He is able to finally go back to Florence, and he tries as hard as he can to stay as close to politics as he can. He likes to keep friends that are well connected. But as I say, it's unclear to me whether or not he ever actually got back into public office. One of the things, like I said, I found interesting about the guy that, I don't know if it's true or not, but like I said, he claimed that he was more or less born poor. All the research I did suggested otherwise. In fact, it suggests, his dad was an attorney, which I would think would have still been a good job back then, and perhaps his father's connections may have even got him his start inside government. So we'll never know, but in his eyes, he was poor, and having moved away from Florence, he thought of himself as poor then. My guess is that once he'd become used to the lifestyle of a diplomat, that from his perspective, he wasn't able to. From his perspective, he had grown up poor. But my feelings is that he probably never actually was a peasant or anything like that. All right, so he does die in 1527. Again, there are some research that suggests that he tried to get his old job back in Second Chancery, but he lost, and some say that he did hold a post. So finally, The Prince is published in 1532. Whether or not he ever actually meant it to be published is not known. I'm guessing it's possible that they really didn't mean it to be published. What The Prince was really about, just to give a quick summary, it's basically well, contrary to previous political philosophy treatises, that advocated ideal governments, or having some sort of moral obligation to the people. He didn't do any of that. He said a leader should be ruthless and do basically whatever it takes to stay in power. So definitely a breakaway from the old. So The Prince is read by Napoleon, for example. Said he read The Prince. It's been read by thousands and thousands of people throughout history. Probably in our most modern day, it's a little bit famous because a rapper from the 90s by the name of Tupac apparently read it and released an album named Machiavelli. Of course, he spelled it wrong, but also it's almost required reading for business leaders. It's still read today, and what I think is interesting about what he wrote is that actually he may or may not have really even believed in what he wrote. I mean, here's a guy that worked very loyally and for the Republic. He seemed to like the Republic, enjoy his work with the Republic, yet he writes this piece of work basically that basically goes against the Republic. Again, like I said, I think it's all just because what he really valued was his place in politics. And like I said, he had other works. He wrote a military tactical book called The Art of War. He also wrote the Discourses on Livy, which is more or less a history of Rome. He was a pretty big historian. He wrote a lot about Rome. He actually had a lot about Rome contained within The Prince. A lot of references were how the Romans kept power. He also wrote a history of Florence at the time. He wrote a lot of history books. He was a historian, and as I said earlier, he wrote a lot of plays and poems, and these are actually what he was famous for during his life. All of his history books and his philosophy books were relatively unknown during his lifetime. It was his plays and poems for which he was famous. Anyway, he's an example of an Italian that probably wasn't appreciated during his lifetime or celebrated nearly as much as he is in history. One of the benefits he really seems to have had was the invention of the printing press. I think it was one of the first books that was probably produced on a mass level. It wasn't necessarily received well by a lot of people. Shakespeare really denounced it. A lot of people have denounced it just for its basic indifference towards humans. But then, as I said, business leaders and the type still enjoy it to this day. Probably one of the most interesting things I think about it too is that, I would never use a book like this. I wouldn't have a need to, but I couldn't help but think this is sort of an inside glimpse of what these guys are really thinking about, the leaders. Machiavelli more or less wrote an inside view of what was going on with these powerful people. Anyway, that's my presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.